Dawn bled pale across the valley, a thin mist curling from the river, like smoke escaping a wound. Against the paling sky, a wooden scaffold loomed, unfinished timber hammered together for one purpose alone. The wood was still green in places, sap weeping from fresh-cut boards like tears the earth refused to shed. A bell tolled, slow and reluctant, each strike stretching into silence that seemed heavier than sound itself. The woman stood barefoot in the frost, her feet already numb against the frozen ground that sparkled with ice crystals sharp as broken glass. Wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her skin, leaving angry red welts that spoke of sleepless nights spent in the magistrate's cellar. Her hair, once braided neatly for market days, now tangled by restless nights and rough handling, fell across her face like a veil of autumn leaves, yet her eyes burned through it. Two embers refusing to be smothered, holding a fire that neither chains nor accusations could extinguish. Villagers lined the muddy path, silent as standing stones, their faces pale and drawn in the morning light. Some trembled, clutching their rosaries with white-knuckled fingers, the wooden beads worn smooth by countless desperate prayers. Others whispered benedictions meant to protect themselves, not her, words that tasted of ash and cowardice on their tongues. Children peered from behind their mother's skirts, eyes wide with a terrible fascination of witnessing something they did not yet understand but would never forget. Her crime was not theft, nor murder, nor any deed that left blood on the ground or gold missing from purses. It was something more poisonous in the eyes of the fearful. Knowledge. She had healed with herbs gathered under moonlight, delivered children when their mothers' screams tore through winter nights, spoken truths others wished to bury beneath the weight of tradition and fear. And in a season when cattle rotted in their fields and children coughed through the night, suspicion needed no evidence, only whispers and pointing fingers. Her neighbors, once her patients, once grateful recipients of her remedies, now condemned her with eyes that refused to meet her own. The noose hung like an accusation above her head, its shadow falling across her shoulders like a shroud. Rope and silence. These would be her judges, her jury, her executioners. Yet, when the priest read her sentence, his voice cracking over words he had never wanted to speak, she did not flinch. She did not beg. She lifted her chin with the dignity of queens, staring not at heaven with its promise of mercy, but at the crowd that had betrayed her with their silence. And then she spoke. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper, but the unnatural silence carried it further than any cry could have traveled. This valley shall never know peace until truth is spoken. The words lingered in the air like smoke from a dying fire, clinging to the morning mist as the stool was kicked away, as the rope snapped tight with sound like breaking bones. The crowd gasped as one, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to steal all the air from the valley, but no sound followed, only silence, suffocating and unnatural, as though the earth itself held its breath in horror at what it had witnessed. Was it the woman who perished that morning beneath the pale sky, or was it innocence itself that died with her, swinging gently in the wind, whispers before the fire? To understand her end, we must step back into the weeks before her trial, when autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson. The land lay drenched in fading sunlight, leaves falling in swirls of amber and rust, drifting like lost memories across paths she had walked for 30 years. Yet beneath the beauty, shadows grew longer each day, curling at the edges of each field like dark fingers reaching for the light. It began with the cattle. They sickened inexplicably, their eyes turning glassy and distant, their milk souring even as it left their bodies. Farmers found them standing motionless in pastures, as though listening to voices only they could hear. Crops blackened before harvest, stalks twisting into shapes that hurt to look upon, as though frost had come early to this land alone, while neighboring valleys flourished. And in the taverns, in whispered gatherings outside the church after Sunday service, in the market squares where voices dropped to conspiratorial murmurs, a single name grew like mold on damp stone. Hers. She was a widow, her husband claimed by fever 3 winters past, living at the edge of the valley in a cottage that seemed to exhale smoke from its chimney like sighs from a weary soul. Her hands bore the stains of her work, sage and lavender, soil and wildflower roots, the honest dirt of one who made her living from the earth's bounty. To some, this made her a blessing, a keeper of old wisdom in an age that was forgetting its roots. To others, an omen walking among them in human form. She carried always a small leather diary, its pages yellow with age and pressed with herbs, filled with sketches of remedies and notes written in a hand that spoke of education unusual for a woman of her station. To her, it was memory itself, a record of healing, of lives saved, of knowledge passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter like a sacred trust. To her accusers, it became scripture of the devil, proof of unholy communion with forces beyond Christian understanding. The priests thundered from their pulpits each Sunday, their voices echoing off stone walls as they warned that Satan himself walked among them in the guise of neighbor and kin. Each sermon was a bell tolling, slow, heavy, methodically shaping fear into certainty, doubt into condemnation. The congregation hung on every word, hungry for someone to blame for their misfortunes, eager to believe that their suffering had a name and a face. Mothers who once begged her for remedies to ease their children's fevers now clutched those same children tighter when her shadow passed their doors. Men who had shared her bread and praised her wisdom now spat into the dirt when her footsteps touched theirs, as though her very presence could contaminate their souls. At night, by the wavering light of a single candle, she wrote in her diary with hands that never trembled. Her words were not confessions of guilt, but reflections of a soul preparing for the storm she saw gathering. They mistake survival for sin. They trade their fear for fire. But it is they who burn, not I. As the nights grew longer and the accusations grew bolder, children began throwing stones at her door, daring each other closer, as if touching her walls meant touching evil itself. They would run shrieking with delight and terror when she appeared in her doorway, yet she never chased them, never raised her voice. She simply watched with those burning eyes that seemed to see too much. And when an infant died in its crib, little more than a blue-lipped whisper departing on a winter morning, the mourning mother, once her closest friend, whispered through tears that tasted of salt and betrayal. It was her herbs that did this, her hand that cursed my baby. Fear was a fire that needed no kindling once it caught hold. By the time the first formal accusations rose to the magistrate's ears like smoke from a hidden blaze, her fate was already sealed. Not by demons or devils, but by envy, ignorance, and the silence of those who knew better but lacked the courage to speak. The trial of shadows. The trial came with winter's first storm, as though the heavens themselves sought to wash clean what was about to unfold. Snow lashed the wooden courthouse with icy fists, shutters banging against the walls like drums announcing Judgment Day. Inside, the air hung thick with smoke and incense, the stench of damp woolen cloaks, the nervous sweat of villagers crowding the rough-hewn benches. The judges had elevated on their platform, their black robes casting long shadows that seemed to crawl across the plank floor like living things. Shadows that stretched and writhed in the flickering candlelight, reaching toward the accused as though eager to embrace her. The priest's voice filled the rafters with scripture, but it was fear, not faith, that truly filled the room. Fear so thick you could taste it on your tongue like copper and ash. Witnesses rose one by one from the packed benches, their testimonies dripping poison more deadly than any herb in her collection. A neighbor claimed with shaking voice to have seen her walking barefoot in his orchard at the stroke of midnight, her arms raised to the moon as though drawing down curses from its pale face. A child, coached by parents who had lost their livestock, insisted with wide, frightened eyes that he had heard her whisper with unseen voices in the fields, speaking words and languages that predated Christ himself. Another swore upon his mother's grave that her herbs had killed his prize oxen, though he had sought her healing touch for his own ailments just months before. Each lie was wrapped in trembling voices and tear-stained cheeks, transformed by repetition and fear into truth more solid than stone. And in the corner of the courtroom, coiled on the magistrate's table like a serpent made of hemp, lay the rope, waiting, watching with the patience of predators, as though it had already chosen its neck, already felt the weight it would bear. When her turn came to speak in her own defense, she did not fall to her knees and beg for mercy as they expected. She did not weep or wail, or tear her hair in the manner of the guilty seeking absolution. Instead, she raised her chin with quiet dignity and asked questions that cut deeper than any blade. If healing is a crime worthy of death, then what name do you give the hunger that stars your children while you feast? If herbs gathered by moonlight are the devil's work, then why do you drink from my remedies when winter agues rack your bones? If knowledge is sin, then what virtue lies in ignorance? Her words landed heavy in the stifling air, yet none among the judges or witnesses dared answer. Silence filled the room like smoke from a smothered fire, thick and choking, pressing against eardrums until they ached with the weight of unspoken truths. The candles began to flicker as though stirred by invisible breath, shadows twisting into grotesque shapes that danced across the walls like demons celebrating. The fire in the great hearth crackled louder, hungry flames reaching upward as though feeding on the villagers' collective guilt. Each testimony seemed to fan those flames higher, until reason itself was drowned beneath the roar of mass hysteria and willful blindness. The gavel struck the wooden block like a thunderclap that shook the very foundations. Guilty of witchcraft in Congress with evil spirits, the chief judge intoned, his voice echoing in the sudden, terrible silence. And in that moment, as if the very heavens recoiled from injustice, thunder tore across the valley with a sound like the world splitting open. Windows rattled in their frames, torches sputtered and nearly died, and for one heart-stopping instant, it seemed the earth itself was protesting a lie that had just been sanctified as law. But the storm raging outside could not stop the verdict that had already been written in fear and sealed with silence. Valley in flames. The day of execution dawned under a sky bruised purple and black with approaching storm. Clouds rolled heavy and low across the mountain peaks, swollen with rain and crackling with suppressed lightning. The scaffold rose against this ominous backdrop like a wound carved from living timber, its shadow falling across the frost-hardened ground like a stain that no amount of rain could wash clean. Villagers pressed together in the square, cloaks drawn tight against wind that carried the scent of snow, and something else, something that made the horses restless and the dogs whine. They huddled not from cold alone, but from guilt they would never name, shame they would carry to their own graves. Children clung to their mother's skirts with white-knuckled fists, eyes wide with a terrible fascination of witnessing something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. She walked to the scaffold with steady steps, her bare feet leaving no sound on the frozen ground. The rope was looped around her neck with ceremonial precision, its coarse fibers scratching against skin that had never known such violation. She looked upward, not to heaven with its promise of divine judgment, but to the mountains, ancient and indifferent, older than church or crown or the petty fears of mortal men. And she spoke again, her voice stronger now, carried on a rising wind like prophecy itself. You will choke on your silence, and your children will drink deeply of the fear you have brewed this day. The priest tried desperately to drown her word with prayers, his Latin stumbling and cracking under the weight of what he was sanctifying. But the church bell began to toll, wild and frantic, as though rung by unseen hands that would not be denied their voice. Each bronze strike was a hammer blow against the villagers' hearts, a countdown to judgment that had nothing to do with earthly courts. Then came the drop. Her body swung, but the storm that had been building all morning refused to be held back any longer. Lightning split the sky in jagged scars of white fire, illuminating the scene below in stark, terrible clarity. Wind tore through the crowd with the fury of avenging angels, whipping cloaks like battle standards and scattering hats and bonnets across the muddy square. Rain began to fall, but not the gentle weeping of natural grief. This was a deluge that hissed and steamed when it struck the torches, yet somehow the flames leaped higher instead of dying. A burning brand fell from someone's nerveless fingers, igniting a merchant's cart loaded with hay. Fire spread with unnatural hunger, devouring market stalls and storage sheds, reaching for sky with tongues of orange and gold. Animals screamed in their panic, horses rearing and breaking their tethers, cattle bellowing as they fled the unnatural flames. Villagers shouted over the wind. Some tried to organize bucket brigades, others simply running for the shelter of their homes. The valley itself seemed to tremble, the very ground shaking as though the earth was trying to cast off the weight of injustice that had just been added to its burden. In the chaos, her diary, hidden away in her cottage on the valley's edge, was said to burst into flames of its own accord, its pages curling into ash that swirled upward like prayers written in smoke. Witnesses claimed the ash formed shapes as it rose, letters and words that spelled out curses in languages they could not read but somehow understood. When the tempest finally broke and spent its fury, leaving the valley drenched and steaming under a clearing sky, the scaffold still stood, blackened by rain and fire, scarred by wind and lightning, but upright, yet where her body had swung just hours before. Only rope remained, frayed and blackened, hanging empty as though she had simply vanished into the storm itself. But her curse lingered in the air, thick as smoke, clinging to every doorway and windowsill, seeping into the very stones of the village like a stain that would never fade. Ashes of the guilty. Morning came gray and hollow, the sun struggling to penetrate clouds that hung over the valley like a shroud. The land lay drenched and battered, fields trampled by fleeing crowds, market stalls reduced to charred skeletons of wood and iron. The scaffold loomed in the square, blackened by fire and rain, the empty noose swaying gently like a serpent's tongue tasting the bitter air. But the peace the villagers had sought through blood and rope did not come with the dawn. Cattle continued to die in ever-growing numbers, their bodies found stiff and cold in fields that had once been green, their eyes now clouded with film that reflected no light, crops withered in soil that had been fertile for generations, stalks turning black, and brittle as though touched by frost in the height of summer. Wells that had never run dry began to taste of sulfur and ash. Children woke screaming in the dark hours before dawn, their small hands clutching at their throats as though invisible ropes pulled tight around their necks. They spoke of dreams where a woman walked through their bedrooms, her face hidden by tangled hair, her voice whispering words that burned like brands on their memory. The villagers muttered of demons and Satan's revenge, gathering in nervous clusters outside the church to trade theories and assign blame to anyone but themselves. Yet no priest could explain why the bell tolled by itself in the deep of night, its cracked voice moaning across the valley like a soul in torment. No amount of holy water could silence the smell of sage and lavender that drifted from her abandoned cottage when the wind turned, carrying with it the memory of healing hands and gentle wisdom. Her diary was found 3 days after the execution, discovered in the ashes of her heart by brave souls who finally dared to enter her home. Half-burned yet somehow still legible, its pages seemed to glow with their own light in the gloom of the cottage. The words written there spoke not of devil worship or dark magic, but of healing and hope, of love for neighbors who had repaid kindness with betrayal. But it was the last line, written in a hand that trembled with approaching death, that chilled even the priests who read it. Truth burns longer than fire, and silence screams louder than any voice. Those words seemed to burrow into the minds of all who heard them, taking root like seeds in fertile soil. They clung to the valley's collective conscience like frost that would not melt, and those who were condemned began to feel unease settle in their bones like a chronic ache that no remedy could touch. In the long nights that followed, they began to wonder, not aloud, never where others might hear, but in the secret chambers of their hearts, whether she had truly been a witch, or merely their own conscience given human form, and offered up as sacrifice to their fears. The rope had ended her body, stopped her breath, stilled her heart, but her silence had only begun to speak, and its voice would echo through the generations like thunder that never quite fades away. The curse that echoes. Centuries have passed since that terrible morning, yet the valley has never learned to forget. Travelers speak in hushed voices of autumn nights when mist rises thick along the mountain ridges, and a woman's figure can be seen walking the high path that leads to the old cottage site. Her face remains shadowed, hidden behind hair that moves in wind no living person can feel, her footsteps making no sound on stones worn smooth by countless years of rain and snow. She pauses sometimes, they say, turning toward the valley below as though searching for something that can never be found. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps merely understanding. The bell, long since cracked and corroded, abandoned when the new church was built, still tolls on certain nights when the air grows thick and strange. Its voice drifts through the valley, thin and sorrowful as a cry of a lost soul, mourning what cannot be undone and what should never have been. Blacksmiths have tried to silence it, cutting the ropes and boarding up the tower, but the bronze tongue finds ways to speak that have nothing to do with earthly mechanics. Children still dare one another to approach the ruins of her cottage, though little remains now but a foundation of mossy stones and a chimney that stands like a finger pointing accusingly at the sky. Wild herbs grow there in impossible abundance, sprouting from cracks in stone where no seed should be able to take root, their fragrance carrying memories of gentle hands and whispered healing words. Sage and lavender, rosemary and thyme, they bloom out of season and survive the hardest winters, as though tended by invisible hands that never rest. The walls that still stand bear stains that look like handprints, dark marks that seem to shift and move when viewed from the corner of the eye. Some claim these are shadows left by the fire that consumed her diary, reaching out in its final moments to leave evidence of the truth that burned within those pages. Local historians speak of the rope itself, though the scaffold rotted away generations ago and was finally torn down by a mayor who thought he could end the haunting with hammer and saw. Yet on certain nights, when fog rolls down from the mountains and wraps the valley in gray silence, witnesses swear they can see it swinging from empty air, creaking against a wind that touches nothing else. But her true curse was never supernatural fire or ghostly visitations. It was memory itself. The valley is haunted not by demons or restless spirits, but by the weight of its own injustice, by the knowledge that evil had worn the faces of neighbors and friends. Each whisper of wind through the valley carries her final words like an eternal echo. This valley shall never know peace until truth is spoken. And the truth is this: it was not the devil who claimed her life that gray morning in 1697, but the valley itself. Its fear, its ignorance, its willingness to sacrifice innocence on the altar of suspicion. She died not for witchcraft, but for the crime of being different, of knowing too much, of representing hope in a season when despair seemed easier to embrace. The rope that killed her was woven not from hemp, but from silence. The silence of those who knew better but said nothing, who watched injustice unfold and told themselves it was not their place to interfere. And that rope still hangs over the valley, invisible but unbreakable, a noose made of collective guilt that tightens with each generation's refusal to speak the truth. In every toll of the phantom bell, in every bloom of impossible herbs, in every child's nightmare hands at their throat, the valley remembers. And until someone finds the courage to speak her name with honor instead of fear, to admit that she died for their sins rather than her own, the curse will continue. For some hauntings are not the work of restless dead, but of living consciences that refuse to rest. And in this valley, where autumn mist still carries the scent of sage and sorrow, that conscience walks eternal, waiting for the truth to finally, after all these centuries, be spoken aloud.